What you're about to hear is my conversation with American-born Israeli author and journalist Yossi Klein Halevi. Yossi's most recent book is Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor. Throughout our conversation, Yossi discusses his goal in writing that book. He also discusses his next project based on Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor. As you will hear, Yossi has thought about the Israeli-Palestinian issue quite a bit and over multiple decades. I found his ideas to be nuanced yet unapologetic. Obviously, not everyone will agree with everything he says, and that's okay. I hope the conversation offers insight into thinking about and understanding the Israeli-Palestinian situation. I would like to thank the I Center for providing funding for this project. And now, without further ado, my conversation with Yossi Klein Halevi. Let's just jump into it. A lot of times what I feel happens in these conversations around Israel is that we're battling truth claims, right? The way you write is very much narrative, right? You want both sides to acknowledge each other's narrative. But what that seems to me to run up always against is the truth claim, right? But the other side's narrative goes against the grain of truth. How do you find to balance those two things?
Well, you're really touching on the heart of the project that I began last year with the publication of Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor. And I call it a project rather than a book because for me, the book was the first stage. And it really is an unfolding project of bringing in competing narratives, irreconcilable narratives, and having Palestinians and Israelis tell each other their narratives without any expectation of convincing the other side. I have immersed in Palestinian narratives, and I have emerged from that process with my narrative more or less intact. But when I think about the conflict, I now have Palestinian voices in my head. They haven't undermined my love and commitment to my narrative, but those voices have softened the hard edges of my narrative, so that when I think about the conflict, I'm not only thinking of my understanding, but I also have the competing voices somewhere in my consciousness. Now that's a very kind of thin line to walk, but my hope is that just as I've allowed Palestinian voices to be in my head, the Palestinians that I'm in relation with will allow my voice to be in their head. I'll give you an example. I have a friend, someone who I'm in regular contact with, who is a BDS activist, Palestinian. And he sent me a letter saying that he read the book 3 times. And
The Letters to the Palestinians.
Yeah. And he proceeded to tell me what moved him. There were parts of it that really did move him, parts that infuriated him, parts that he considered propaganda. And so we have a back and forth. But think about that for a moment. He's telling me what his narrative is about 1967, which I dismiss completely. His narrative of 1967, which is normative on the Palestinian side, is that Israel was never threatened. We initiated the war in order to conquer territory. Now, I know that that's not true because I wrote a book about 67, about the paratroopers in the battle for Jerusalem.
Like dreamers.
Like dreamers. And I know that there was no plan. They were completely taken by surprise. And suddenly they're thrust into East Jerusalem because the Jordanian army is bombarding West Jerusalem. But that's completely not part of their narrative. And so when you're asking me about truth and lies, I have my truth. I know that we accepted partition in 1947 and we were attacked in 1948. I know that wherever Arab armies were victorious, there was ethnic cleansing of Jews, if not massacres. Now, Palestinians don't know what I know. They know something different. I have tried to learn or listen to what they know, and I'm asking Palestinians to listen to what I know. Now, to some extent, I have to tell you, Aviv, I'm very uncomfortable with a conversation over narratives because I really believe in truth. I believe in historic truth. I was a journalist for many years. The premise of journalism is that there is objective truth to be found, however elusive. And yet I opted for this methodology because I realized that the war over facts is essentially unwinnable. And more than that, the Israeli side is losing the war over facts. Initially, when I started this book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, I had all kinds of facts in there. I had a whole section that I was going to write about Israeli archaeology. You say we never had roots here. Well, look at all of this. But then you go into the web and you find Palestinian sites that are set up to quote debunk Israeli archaeology, to prove that it's all a Zionist myth. Now, how do you argue with that? We are in the era of post-truth. And we are a people that lives and dies by truth. You know, the word emet, truth in Hebrew, is such a fundamental word in Hebrew and Jewish consciousness. And it's an amazing word, right? It has the first word, Aleph. The middle word, Mem, is the middle letter in the Hebrew alphabet. And then Tav, the last word, the last letter. And so Emet is beginning, middle, end. That is a normative Judaic understanding of truth. There is absolute truth, and we can discern it. And then suddenly you enter into the Palestinian and Israeli swamp, and you don't know where you are after a while. Every single step is contested. And so, you know, I'm a veteran of the facts wars, the wars over who did this to whom and why.
And there always seems to me in conversations that there's an additional fact that I didn't, even if I had a very well structured calculus, there's always another fact that's brought in and sort of, oh, we need to reshift everything now.
Yeah, I'll give you an example, okay? One of the recurring facts that I get in letters that I've been receiving from Palestinians is a quote from Herzl's diary. Theodor Herzl, founder of Zionism, kept extensive diaries, multi-volume diaries. Somebody found a quote that he once wrote that we may have to force the peasants across the border. It's a very ugly quote. I'd never heard of it because it isn't part of a normative Zionist worldview, and yet Palestinians seem to know this quote far more than Zionists do. And so when I first came across that, I looked it up. I saw, okay, it's an authentic quote. Then I thought, well, you're pulling out one quote from Herzl's diary, which is, I don't know, multi-volume diary, and yet Herzl wrote a whole novel called Alt-Neuland, Old New Land, where he envisioned a kind of a utopian Zionist novel, imagining the future Israeli society of equality between Arabs and Jews, and one of the main characters is Rashid Bey, a Palestinian. And I'm thinking, here's a whole book that Herzl writes about his vision. This is his blueprint, and it completely disappears from Palestinian consciousness. But on page 792 of volume 8 of Herzl's diary, some researcher found this ugly quote, and that becomes the smoking gun. So there's your fact. Now my counterfact is, okay, he wrote that, but here's a whole book that he wrote, and that has no weight. So it's you cherry pick quotes, you connect the dots, and here's your bill of indictment.
And you come with a preconceived, with what you want to prove in advance.
Absolutely.
So that's the challenge.
Absolutely. And so in the end, I decided to walk away from the war over facts, both because I believe it's unwinnable, and secondly, because it's frankly boring. And you can just argue endlessly. And third, because I really wanted to test the possibility of whether we can really hear each other's stories and whether we can be moved by each other's stories and not only threatened by them. And what I'm doing in the next edition of Letters, which will be a paperback edition coming out in June, it will have a new epilogue, Letters from Palestinians to their Israeli Neighbor. And it's 50 pages. The book, as it now stands, is 200 pages. I'm adding another 50 pages that of letter writers who tell the Palestinian narrative, who attack my narrative, and I'm giving them the last word in the book. And I'm doing that for several reasons. One, because I think it was important for me to honor their goodwill and courage in responding to a Zionist narrative. And secondly, because I think that if we're going to break the impasse, we need to really work in unpredictable ways. And I have no grand delusions of this book achieving anything more than it already has, which is to elicit some very powerful Palestinian responses. And my intention for the book is to model what a possible conversation between Palestinians and Israelis would look like over competing narratives, and maybe to help fashion a new language in which Palestinians and Israelis speak about our history.
So walk me through the next step of, once aside, I mean, you said that a piece of information was brought to you, you looked it up. Ideally, the other side would also look it up and, you know what, the Jews aren't being disingenuous. But how is it that if we're still left with two competing narratives, what's the next step? How do you still move the process forward?
So
via narrative rather than facts.
It's a very important question. Excuse me.
It's a hard topic.
It's a hard topic. One of the key questions about a future peace process is, how do we prevent the traumas of the past from continuing to impose a kind of veto on the future? And so the Western approach would be, well, you just don't deal with the traumas. I spoke at J Street, at the National J Street Conference, together with a Palestinian activist, Huda Abu Arqub, and we were asked by a member of the audience, the two of you are talking about 1948, and you're talking about all the traumas. Can't you just leave that in the past? And Huda and I together almost shouted, no, that's our story. We are not disembodied existentialist beings cut off and adrift in history. We are in a constant conversation, Jews and Arabs, with our ancestors. This is the Middle East, not the Midwest, as I was often told when I moved here. and this place is in constant conversation with the past. In America, there's a saying, oh, that's history. And when you say that's history, what do you mean? That's irrelevant, right? Here, when you say that's history, people start paying attention. Oh, that's history. That's my story. These are my ancestors. That's where I come from. And so one of the mistakes I feel, one of the many mistakes of the Oslo process of the 90s, was that it tried to circumvent history and just be future-oriented. The past, if it is not honored in this part of the world, will sabotage the future. You cannot expect Palestinians and Israelis to go into this conflict feeling that they need to leave their wounds, their grievances, their claims in the past. Those claims and wounds have to be honored. And so what the strategy that I'm trying out here, and it's an experiment, that's all it is to see whether, if we give each side the space to say, this is what it was like for me. This was what it was like for the Jewish people in 1948, 3 years after the Shoah, to face a war of extermination, as the head of the Arab League called it. Azam Pasha. This is how we experienced it. Now, don't tell me, oh, Azam Pasha meant this. He didn't mean literal extermination. I want to tell you how we experienced that 3 years after the Shoah. And you're going to tell me how your families experienced the dread of the Jewish militias approaching their villages and thinking that, to use a Jewish term, the Cossacks are coming. Mm-hmm. Now, were they? No. From my point of view, no. From your point of view, of course. Mm-hmm. Tell me your story. And don't expect me to agree with you, but I'm going to listen respectfully and as empathically as I can. And maybe in that way, we'll be able to let the ghosts rest.
So it's sort of acknowledgement and surfacing, et cetera, would enable sort of the beginning of a healing process.
A kind of catharsis. The danger, of course, is that it'll turn into a shouting match.
Right.
But that's why it was so important for me to take these letters, and they're very difficult letters from Palestinians for me as an Israeli to read, but to honor those letters and give them the last word in a book that was written to tell the Israeli narrative and to give the Palestinian narrative the last word. Now, it's risky. Mm-hmm. It is risky. First of all, it's emotionally risky. I don't know how I'm going to feel when I see this in print.
So that leads me to what tools are you using? Mm-hmm. I know you do some meditation. Is it mindfulness before you approach this? What tools are you using to approach these letters, to simultaneously allow them to impact you and not yell at them back? Like, you're trying to balance something very delicate here, right?
Well, I am a meditator, very much so. I've been a meditator for many years. I do a form of Jewish contemplative meditation. It's not mindfulness. It's a meditation rooted in Kabbalah, mm-hmm. and it is an attempt to bring the presence of God into one's life. That's really the purpose. Very different from mindfulness. Mm-hmm. I love mindfulness, but this is a different move.
Right. No, this is just an example of what right. tools can be used to...
Yeah, definitely.
And specifically, if I may add, to educators, right? So people trying to educate Americans, and even in Israel, but specifically American about Israel, what tools would you offer to an educator?
Well, first of all, before an educator thinks of how to convey this to students, the educator has to go through a process. You have to internalize deeply, first of all, what this story means to you before you even sort out the details. What is your narrative? What's your story here? What is this story to you? And then, once you have a firm narrative that you can own in place, then you have the strength to confront the other narrative. Look, just this morning, I read a really bad review of Letters, and I kept putting it off.
You knew it was going to be bad.
Yeah.
Somewhat sadistically, you decided
absolutely.
to. Okay.
I knew this was going to be bad, and I was not disappointed. But I also knew that I shouldn't read it until I was in a more stable place, in a place of equilibrium. And so I allowed myself to read it this morning. And I read it with a certain measure of detachment. And I was reading it. It was first of all, it was written, once I realized that it was written by someone who has deep animus to Zionism, I relaxed. Because it wasn't personal anymore. It wasn't really about my book. It was about all of us. It was,
right.
It was about all our books.
Right. And your book is merely...
It was about the Tanakh, really. And it was a Jewish reviewer, of course. And he was furious at me for presenting what he derogatorily called a mainstream Zionist narrative. Now,
Why is that bad?
Now, as far as I'm concerned, that's one of the strengths of the book, because this is a book about reaching out to Palestinians. It's a book about empathy. It's a book that invites the Palestinian narrative to respond. I'm not looking for Palestinians who are going to agree with me. I'm looking for a normative Palestinian narrative. So shouldn't a normative Israeli narrative be welcome in that kind of context? But no, the reviewer wants surrender. He wants a Jew who will beat your breast and say, ashamnu bagadnu, we've committed all these crimes and offenses. And as we say in Hebrew, ma lasot, what can you do? Most of us here are not in the Yom Kippur mode in this conflict. We most Israelis believe that the blame certainly is shared by the Palestinian national movement, if not heavily weighted against the Palestinian national movement, which of course he found deeply offensive. Well, that's our narrative. Now, what I try to do in this book is create a language for mainstream Israelis to be able to speak about these issues with Palestinians in a reasonable and empathic way without sacrificing my narrative. One of the problems in Israel is that peace is seen as a left-wing cause today. Right. And the left is as we see in these elections, the left is a shrinking minority. Mm-hmm. The left is not a viable political force in Israel anymore. The conflict here is not between left and right, which is what many American Jews still think it is. Conflict here is between center and right. And this is a centrist book. And so if you're asking me to kind of go back to your question, what are the tools that I bring to this? First of all, it is an attempt to really take a deep breath and step back. Secondly, it is asking myself very deeply, what is my narrative? What am I ready to stand on? And once I've established that, and that's what this book was really an exercise for me. It's like, well, I'm writing to a Palestinian. That's the hardest audience with which to talk about Zionism, obviously. And so I'm going to stand in front of a Palestinian and say, this is my ani ma'amin. This is what I believe about the Zionist narrative. How do I say it? What is it that I really believe? And once I came to that conclusion that I deeply believe this other bit, I'm not so sure. So I'm going to leave that out. But what I'm writing in this book, I am ready to stand and fight for. Mm-hmm. And that gives me a certain inner confidence and a strength to then listen to the Palestinian narrative. But I had to go through that process, mm-hmm. a sifting process. What are the elements of my narrative that maybe aren't that important to me anymore?
Mm-hmm. So a lot of people, and this is one of the main criticisms that I experience in the U.S., is the idea of the reciprocity. I think many, at least from my perspective, are willing to listen to the other side, are willing to accept. And I have a story from Rabbi Schlesinger from the Shtachim.
Oh yeah.
And Hanan Schlesinger, right? And he came to our synagogue and he spoke with us, and he came with his Palestinian neighbor, and they spoke to us, etc. And after the lecture,
those guys are real neighbors.
Yes. Yes. That's how they sort of met, and right. They have a phenomenal story. Uh-huh. And after that, and I asked him, okay, where are you going next after our synagogue? And we're a sort of mainstream, open Orthodox, but still, it tends right. And I asked them,
they were not going to a mosque.
Exactly. That's exactly my point. And therein lies sort of the frustration that I feel that a lot of people on our side say. They say, we're open, we're willing. But you're asking us for something where the other side is about 10 light years from where we are. Right. The conversation here is, should we understand more the conflict and see the other side a little more and understand, like, nuances?
Absolutely.
So how would you even begin to approach that with a side that says, you're asking unfair, you're asking one side to do something that the other side isn't even being expected to do?
So, look, here's my process, Aviv. This is what I went through in writing this book. And I alluded to it in the introduction, but I'll flesh it out a little bit for you. That is, in the late 90s, I went on a year-long journey into Palestinian Islam and Christianity. And it was through the territories in the West Bank and Gaza and the North and the Galil. And the purpose of the journey was to listen, to learn. And who are my neighbors? What are their faiths? What is Islam? And also to hear their stories, to try to see what this conflict looks like, even a taste of it through their experience, to hear their stories. I sat in mosques and I listened to people. And it was an extraordinary year. I didn't talk very much. I listened. This latest book, Letters, is an attempt to take that to the next step. I feel that I have the right to ask my neighbors to listen to what I have to say because I spent all that time trying to hear their story. And so I've seen this book as part of a process that began with that previous book, that journey, that 1 year. That journey that I took in the late 90s became the basis of a book that I published in 2001 at the entrance to the Garden of Eden. Yep. And so this for me was a kind of a sequel. And now the next step in this journey will be the paperback, which is bringing my voice and Palestinian voices together in the same book. And that for me is really, in some ways, that is the necessary progression for how I needed to play this out. Now, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor was rejected by every New York publisher for 2 years. I couldn't find a publisher, and what they all said to me was the same thing. They said, find a Palestinian, exchange letters, have a dialogue, a debate, whatever it is, and then we'll publish that. And my response was no. This next book, after the Garden of Eden, after telling about my journey into Palestinian society, this next book has to be about my story.
Right.
It has to, and I feel especially strongly about that because the Israeli narrative is being erased in large parts of Western discourse. And I felt the urgent need to tell that story in my subjective way, as I understood the story. And so the progression for me is I started out trying to understand their story. And I needed to do that because I am the occupier and they're the occupied. The next step is, well, wait a minute, okay, you're the occupied, but I'm also indigenous here and I'm under assault and I also have a story that I need you to hear, just as I need to hear your story. And then the stage after that is, can we bring our conflicting narratives
Thesis,
together?
antithesis, synthesis.
Yes.
So I'm wondering if you I live in both communities. I've lived in Israel, I've lived in the U.S., and I'm wondering if there is any plan or any thought of Letters to My American Jewish Brother. And because I see a growing gap, as much as there is between Arabs and Jews in Israel, there is a growing gap between American Jews and Israeli Jews. And that's manifests in many ways. They view Bibi and they get heartburn immediately. And they don't understand.
Right.
I feel that they don't fully grasp what is going on in this country.
No, absolutely not. And initially I thought of writing 2 books. And the second would have been Letters to a Young American Jew.
Okay, close enough.
which is a book that, with a title like that no one would read. So I'm working on a book now, which is not directly a letter to American Jews, but is in a sense very much attempting to do what you're suggesting. And the book is about the Jewish people in the 21st century. What is our narrative? And the argument of the book is that the intensity of the Jewish experience in the 20th century was in its way as momentous as all of 4,000 years of Jewish history that preceded it. And that what we experienced in the 20th century was the fulfillment of the great Jewish dreams and nightmares that Jews carried for thousands of years. The great dream was to return to Zion, of course. There was another dream that we would find safe refuge somewhere and that we would be accepted in the diaspora. The great nightmare was that one of these days, uh, our hosts would decide to just end this story once and for all. All of those dreams and nightmares were fulfilled in dizzying proximity in the mid 20th century. The emergence of the American Jewish community, and of course, the Shoah and the return to Israel. And so, what that means is that we are a people that is carrying an enormous amount of fulfillment of unimaginable events, of fantasies, and we haven't begun to unpack that yet. Part of the confusion that we're living in is, I believe, the fact that we as a people have not begun to try to understand what happened to us. What does it mean? And the Jewish people, in response to this overwhelming assault that we experienced in both the East and the West, the uprooting of 2,500-year-old Jewish communities in the East, the destruction of most of the diaspora in the 20th century, one way or another. This is something we haven't begun to find a language for. And the Jewish response, understandably, to that massive destruction was to rebuild and to reclaim the language of politics. Our response to the 20th century was essentially a political response. And that's not good enough because we are in danger of losing our story. And so the book that I'm trying to write now, and it will be primarily aimed, I guess, at American Jews, is trying to understand what happened to us. What is our story? Who are we? What does it mean to be Jews in the 21st century? And my deep intuition is that the work of the Jews in the 21st century, the real work, is to try to, in some sense, understand the 20th century, to make sense of the 20th century.
It sounds to me like you're going through a Maslow hierarchy where, we needed sustenance, we needed just to survive.
That's a great way to put it.
And then the next stage, you're saying, okay, now we need to answer deeper needs of identity, of who we are, what's our purpose.
Yeah, I haven't actually encountered Maslow in so many years that I just don't even remember that. But yes.
It's a pyramid of needs. And
right.
Now that we're post-survival and...
The problem is we're not.
Right. And
that's what makes Jewish life so complicated.
I mean, and these are one of the conflicts that constantly happen in any conversation where, on the one hand, we... whether or not we're a nuclear power, but we definitely have an incredibly strong army and we're supported and there's no real fear for annihilation. But simultaneously, we feel that the memory of wars, of Yom Kippur War, is just around the corner, right? Mm-hmm. Where the joke was, will the last person leaving turn off the light?
Right.
So we seem to be living in this paradox where we feel incredibly empowered, right? And if we didn't, then our government wouldn't be building settlements or wouldn't be doing anything to anger the world. Mm-hmm. And so we act that way in some sense, and simultaneously we speak in a language of incredible fear of annihilation. So how do you reconcile sort of both those?
It's a great question. I think they're both justified. Mm-hmm. But before we get to that, think for a moment about the psychological condition of a people that moves from 1945 to 1948, that moves from the abyss to one of the peak moments of its history within 3 years. Think of that traumatic transition, that almost psychotic transition.
Dizzying.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Being repeated in May 67 and June 67. May 67, we're in the grips of life and death anxiety. June 67, we're celebrating the greatest military victory in Jewish history, one of the greatest military victories in world history. Then go from June 1967 to October 1973, where we go from the euphoria of the Six-Day War to the despair of the Yom Kippur War. Then 3 years later, we're in Entebbe. And on and on. This is the pattern of the emotional pattern of our relationship to powerlessness and power. So just in that sense, we are so completely out of whack. Then if you throw the Palestinians into the mix, what does that mean? The Palestinians, who are the Palestinians to us? They are, on the one hand, the stranger in our midst, whom the Torah repeatedly warns us to treat decently. And they are also the enemy that is the counterclaimant to this land, and whose national movement still dreams of displacing us. So who are the Palestinians to us? Are they the stranger that we need to treat mercifully? Are they the enemy that we need to resist? Well, yes. Yes to both. And so the Palestinians, if you're taking this dynamic of powerlessness and power, the Palestinians are the cruelest enemy that we could have had, precisely because they're powerless. The one enemy that the Jewish people, after the Holocaust, could not effectively stand up to is an enemy that is coming without power. An enemy that is accusing us of being the aggressor and the occupier. And that is a psychological shift that we weren't ready for. And the problem, again, is that the Palestinians are not just a powerless enemy, a powerless, oppressed people under us, but they also, their national movement has conveyed the message to us that we don't have the right to exist, that one day we won't exist. Now, factor in something else. And that is that most Israelis, I would argue, view this conflict with a split screen in our heads. One side of the screen is Israel versus the Palestinians, and they are David and we are Goliath. The other side of the screen is Israel versus the Arab and Muslim worlds, and then we become David and the region is Goliath. So these dynamics of powerlessness and power are very fluid, and there's really no way to pin down the
proper resolution to view the analysis.
Absolutely. And so that also explains why some Jews go to the far right because we're under threat. And other Jews go to the far left because how could we, of all peoples, now be threatening and oppressing another people?
So, I mean, you've outlined amazingly, I think, the complexity and the inherent paradoxes to the entire situation. Why do you think the conversation, and I feel this more in America, has become so sterile? Why has it become that the complexity can't be viewed? Now, this is not just happening, and we could attribute it to social media, we could attribute it to many things, and I'm just wondering what your personal take is on why has the conversation deteriorated to completely remove any complexity and any both-sideness?
I'm so glad that you used the word sterile, because what I find in the especially American Jewish discourse over Israel is sterility. It's such a boring and predictable conversation.
There's no complexity.
Yes, it's become more complex here because reality forced us into complexity. But it was not always the case. In the past, this was a very one-dimensional conversation as well. You know, I remember when I moved here in the early 80s, and I was trying to simultaneously learn Hebrew and learn Israel. And I did it through the same means, which is I used to watch TV. I would watch Israel TV, which in those years meant one channel, one black and white channel, government-owned channel, with a lot of talk shows, news, actualia, we call it, right? News, kind of current events. Actualia is current events. And it was fascinating and very puzzling to me. You may remember, how old are you?
I am 35.
So you will not necessarily remember this. I mean, I moved to the Israel that you weren't quite No, you were born in America.
Right.
But no, so well, I moved to Israel pretty much when you were born.
But which show? I'm curious.
It was called Popolitica.
Oh, of course. No, Politica ran way into, I
I
think,
was in the
even
90s
the early
too,
90s,
right?
yeah, with
Dan Margalit.
right.
Now it used to be
I
called.
remember
Yes.
Yair Lapid's father was
That's
on
right.
it.
Tommy
Lapid
was
yes,
on it, and Yossi Sarid.
right, and they were just it was a shouting match, but it was also very interesting.
Now you're getting to the punchline, the shouting match. So I'm watching. I'm a new immigrant, and I'm trying to follow. I'm trying to understand. Okay, Yossi Sarid, right? I got that. He's on the left, and Tommy Lapid, he's kind of right, but center. Ehud Olmert, in those years, he's right. Okay. So I'm trying to hear the arguments, but they're all speaking at the same time and shouting at each other.
Right.
And sometimes the moderator would start shouting. And I'm sitting there saying, well, why? Why? First of all, why aren't they allowing each other to finish a sentence? And secondly, they all seem to kind of know what the other one is going to say. They're all anticipating it. And that's when I realized that that's exactly what was happening here. If you are Yossi Sarid, everyone knows what you're going to say about every issue. If you are Ehud Olmert in those years, everyone knows what you're going to say. And so then I asked myself the next obvious question. Why keep going through the ritual? And this ritual was going on for years. And why is this considered to be legitimate television?
Right.
And then I realized something else. Each side was arguing so vehemently and shouting each other down and not bothering to listen to the other side because it knew with absolute certainty that its argument was right. And it knew that it was speaking out of a place of essential truth of Jewish history. And then I realized something else. Both left and right were correct. They were speaking out of a place of absolute Jewish truth. The left was speaking from the place, remember you were strangers in the land of Egypt, do not oppress the stranger. The right was speaking from the place, remember what the tribe of Amalek did to you when you were leaving Egypt and they attacked you unprovoked. Remember you live in a world of enemies, don't be naive. So the left was saying don't be brutal, and the right was saying don't be naive, and they were both right. Where they were both wrong was that they weren't hearing the necessary.
There was no conversation really happening.
No.
Or a true exchange of ideas.
No, but even more than that, they weren't hearing the necessary missing piece in their argument. And so what ended up happening was that you had people shouting past each other, and each side was planting its flag. But then reality bit over here. And first came the first Intifada, which was the moment that convinced large numbers of Israelis that the price of occupying the Palestinians is too high. That was in the late 80s. Then came the second Intifada, which convinced even more Israelis that the price of trying to make peace with a national movement that doesn't accept your legitimacy and your indigenousness is a waste of time.
And if I'm not mistaken, in your book you point to the fact that right after the greatest attempts of peace happened, the greatest terror happened.
That was the big shock for the Israeli public. The American Jewish community never fully internalized that. And I see it all the time when I go to speak, especially in liberal
So it's the lack of lived
circles.
experience that is in a way...
The lack of lived experience. And there's something that we here fail to convey to American Jews. And but what's interesting is if you look at the Israeli elections today, we didn't, contrary to conventional wisdom, the Israeli public didn't veer back toward the pro-settler right. We shifted right, even hard right, on security. But the Israeli public, a majority of the Israeli public, did not go back, as we once did, to embracing the territorial agenda of the settlers. And that's why in these elections, the competition is not between the right and the left, it's between the right and the center. It's the center which says, well, the left was correct about the need for ending the occupation. but the right was correct, that we have to proceed with extreme caution. That's the center. That's the place that I come from, and that's the sensibility that I try to write from.
I think one of the conflations that happens from the American community is that they equivocate the fact that settlements are expanding with the fact that the Israeli public wants it. And I think most of the Israeli public could go either way on this, and they could just as easily say, you know what, for peace, we can give it up.
Absolutely.
And that's the conflation where...
Including many Likud voters,
right,
by the way.
Right. So I wanted to take sort of the mental framework that you've carved out and created with all your research and your experience and apply it to two things that have really been struggling, that I think the American community is struggling right now and going to struggle forward. One of them is criticism of Israel, anti-Semitism, right? Mm-hmm. How do you approach that? And the second one, and you can choose one or both, Ilan Omar, I think, that has been voted into Congress now, who's been a vocal critic of Israel and worries many, many Jews in America about where things are going. Meaning, if this is the trajectory of the Democratic Party, if this is the trajectory of what's happening, and there's just a lack of belief that, despite Omar apologizing, that's not really what's happening here.
Yeah.
How do you approach that entire
Look,
issue?
I would say that my starting point is that anti-Semitism works a little bit differently from other forms of hatred, in the sense that it is about attributing the evils of that a given civilization defines as its most loathsome qualities, and attributing those to the Jews. Christ killer under Christianity, capitalist under Marxism, race polluter under Nazism. And now, in the era of international human rights and anti-racism and anti-colonialism, the Jewish state becomes the archetype of all of those loathsome qualities. So in that sense, I definitely see a pattern at play. The fact that the UN will condemn Israel more often than all other countries combined fits a pattern of demonization, of singling out the Jew to represent a civilization's most detestable qualities. Now, when I think about Palestinians, for example, are Palestinians wrong from their point of view to be singling out Israel and obsessing about Israel's sins, real, half real, or imagined? No. That's their life. Of course.
That's their narrative.
Yes, yes, exactly. And of course, the country that they're going to be most upset about is the country that's occupying them.
Right.
So, are Palestinians acting anti-Semitically by fitting into this pattern of singling out the Jew, or in this case, the Jewish state? I can't say that. But what Palestinians need to be careful of is using this pattern and triggering or legitimizing classical forms of anti-Semitism through this conflict. And here I would say the Palestinian national movement has been quite guilty of even consciously manipulating these deeply ingrained patterns of behavior and thinking in much of the world.
So how would a proper criticism of Israel look?
Generally,
or meaning, how do you
look? Is it anti-Semitic to say
Israel should stop building settlements?
No. Well,
right.
Of
I
course.
think that's an easy one.
Yeah,
right?
That's an easy one. Is it anti-Semitic to say that Israel is killing children at the Gaza border? Well, there have been instances of that, but I got a tweet here today saying that Israel is systematically killing children on the Gaza border. Is that anti-Semitic? Well, it's a lie. It's attributing child murder to Jews. We have a pattern in Jewish history of being accused of killing children for ritual purposes. This isn't that, but is this a postmodern? Is it a postmodern twist on that? Kind of feels that way. when Israel is accused of trading in the organs of dead Palestinians. We kill Palestinians to harvest their organs. Well, is that like the blood libel? It sounds like it. Under postmodern guise. When parts of the international community obsess about Israel. Now here, this is a very tricky thing to define. How do what defines obsession? Well, I would say that when the UN votes to condemn Israel more than all other countries combined, that is an obsession.
Given that we know that other countries are
Given
not
what
all
we're dealing
Switzerland,
with, what we're
right.
dealing with, exactly. And so, yes, that is an obsession. Is there a scientific way of defining obsession? I don't think so. But we kind of know it when we see it, when we feel it, and which is like the old definition of pornography. I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. And we know it. We know what that sounds like. Now, there are those among us who abuse that and who accuse everyone and everything of anti-Semitism.
Trying to shut down the conversation.
Yes,
right.
yes. Whether they're trying to do that deliberately or not, that is how it's perceived. And so, there are some Jews who are not necessarily being effective in this new form of
They're hurting the cause.
war. Yeah, there is a war being declared against the Jewish story.
And I mean, the left today, especially in the U.S., has become very sensitive in light of the political climate and what is being said. And you brought a few examples right now of things that are egregious lies against Jews. And it sometimes surprises me that the left isn't as aggressive in saying you can't, that's an absolute lie. In the same way that they would shut down, President Trump saying something, they don't shut down these lies with the same expediency and the same rigor. And that's a paradox that's interesting to me, right? Why is it that there's sort of a more leeway for Palestinian narrative to get away with egregious lies?
Interesting is a good neutral word here. I would say infuriating,
Yes.
maddening,
Yes.
Sickening.
Yes.
Yeah, that's how.
I think that's a claim. So I want to get to your but I wanted to get to your article that you just wrote today about the desecration of Israel, and in this you criticize what essentially has happened in the in Israeli politics, where Utzma Yehudit has joined together with the former religious party, and Netanyahu has sort of been the organizer or the orchestrator of this. The Shadchan, as you would say, the matchmaker. And you have an interesting history, actually, with Kahanism, and I think this is why this...
There's the word interesting again.
Right. I'm trying to live by what I believe in, which is understanding that there's complexity and nuance, and not take a specific stance.
Right.
So you have a complicated past with Kahanism. So where do you, I mean, what inspired you to really write this post? And it's hard hitting, and I we spoke a little before about that you've gotten some feedback criticizing you for writing this post. So
well, the truth is that I wrote it because the editor of the Times of Israel, David Horowitz, sent me an email basically saying, "No, you have something to say about this, I believe. Why don't you write something?" And the reason I needed prodding, and the reason I had actually thought I would not write about this, is because I wrote a book. My first book was about growing up in the Kahana movement. It was Brooklyn in the late 60s and early 70s. And
where in Brooklyn? Just
in Borough Park.
Oh, okay.
If you know it.
That's,
yeah?
I grew up in Flatbush.
So, oh, no kidding.
Yes.
Flatbush.
Flatbush, yes.
Okay. So I felt that I'd exhausted what I had to say about Kahana and growing up there, and I just didn't want to keep regurgitating old material. I was reacting just very much from a writer's place rather than from a good Israeli citizen place. And when David sent me his email, I realized, well, I have a responsibility as an Israeli citizen to be part of this public conversation at this moment, because this is, for me, a potential turning point. Netanyahu bringing in a racist party into government is...
So you want to unpack that a little more, maybe for people who don't know, that aren't familiar enough with... I mean, Kahana's history is a racist one. Is its current manifestation, because Kahana was murdered, and is its current manifestation as racist, if not more so? Do they just have unpopular ideas?
Well, it's a really good question. And I don't know if you saw the interview in the Times of Israel today with Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is one of the leaders of this party. And he's saying, no, we're different. You know, we're not the old Kahanas. And so the interviewer asks, well, in what way, Mr. Ben-Gvir? And he says, well, our style is different.
Okay.
Okay. Now, in other interviews, he said that he absolutely identifies with the Kahanist ideology.
Right.
Now, the Kahanist ideology is not just abstract principles. One of those abstract principles is that you sanctify the name of God in the world through Jewish power, through the exercise of Jewish power. And the Kahanist understanding of Jewish power is not the normative Jewish understanding. It is Jewish power in the most coarse and abusive sense. It's Baruch Goldstein standing in the middle of a group of Muslims at prayer in Hebron's Tomb of the Patriarchs, and gunning down 29 people while they're on their knees praying.
It's power with actual force and,
yes,
and retribution against another.
Yes, absolutely.
Anything you want to maybe add, like thinking or looking at the talkbacks, anything you want to sort of supplement now to the article?
Well, it's interesting because the talkbacks were coming at me heavily from the right, but also from the left. You know, from the right, people were accusing me of being a turncoat, of course, you know, which I am. I certainly am a turncoat in the Kahanist movement, and I'm quite relieved that I am.
Right.
And from the far left, others were attacking me, saying, "Oh yeah, now you're writing about Israel and racism, but we've been warning all along that Zionism is racism, and you're a liar and a propagandist." So when I put them all together, I start feeling good about myself again. When I read them separately, I get depressed.
Right. You're saying if you angered both sides equally, or if you've angered both sides, then you're probably doing something right. And of course, the center doesn't really comment as much, so it's only the most vocal. We're getting like a selection bias.
Yeah. So it's and then you just have to say, okay, they kind of cancel each other out.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Oh, really a pleasure, Aviv. I really enjoyed speaking with you.